In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
I can't think of a better guest for a paranormal podcast than the gentleman I have on. I was fortunate to have Dr. Vitka in my documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Part of the documentary was we had an actor named Kyle Carvin go to Salem because he felt he had a past life where during the witch trials, he had a incident there. And Dr. Vitka was part of that day with Spellbound Tours. And I know firsthand how awesome his tours are and how great his stories are as well. So grab a bourbon or a beer or your best libation because we're going to have a great show. Mike, welcome aboard. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much for having us. And thank you for enjoying the tour and for putting me in the movie. I know that movie has been getting a lot of watches on Amazon. In fact, a lot of my friends who didn't even know I was in it called me up and were like, "You've got to see this thing, Afraid of Nothing. They're talking about ghosts, and you need to see that guy, Little Frog." And I tell them, just wait, you'll see me in the movie too.
Yeah, you are excellent. We shot that over the course of like 3 to 4 to 5 weekends. And we have a mutual friend, Rob Fitz, who owns, if you're going to go to Salem, you got to have a tour from Spellbound Tours, which is you, and you got to book it out of the Magic Parlor, which our mutual friend, Rob Fitz, owns. He used to be a makeup artist in film. Of course, not many movies are being made now during the pandemic. But Rob bought that a couple years ago, and he was actually the director of my first feature film, and through him, we met.
Yeah, Rob is fantastic. I love the Magic Parlor. It's one of the places I recommend to anybody who comes to Salem. In fact, I was just in there this afternoon letting him know how we were setting up to run the tour again. This is good timing because we're finally reopening Spellbound Tours on the 10th, on July 10th. We're finally back in action. So
let's start with that. Let's give people a flavor of Spellbound Tours, how long you've been around, and kind of what do you cover on your tour? You have a great one. I don't know if you have different types of tours, but one is like ghosts, voodoos, and witches.
Yeah, the Voodoo, Vampire, and Ghost Tour is what we call it. The Voodoo, Vampire, and Ghost Tour is the original paranormal tour. There's a lot of tours in Salem. Pretty much all of them are good, but what makes Spellbound special is that it's actually hosted by paranormal investigators. Most of the time, I'm the guide, and I do have a background in paranormal investigation, and we talk about the techniques people can try to get evidence with. We go into ghost photography a lot. We talk a little bit about the EVP audio recordings, which are some of my favorites. And one thing which is really a lot of fun is usually after the tour, people will show me their ghost photographs that they've gotten not just in Salem, but all around the country and all around the world. And most of the time, I'm able to pretty quickly debunk them and say, unfortunately, what you captured is a reflection of the light, or there's a crack in the camera so that light got in and it's causing a distortion. But every once in a while, our guest will show something phenomenal, something really unexplainable. And that's what makes it a lot of fun for me, is hearing the people's stories and seeing their ghostly evidence. Now, we talk about both current hauntings as well as historic hauntings based on the Salem witch trial. And a lot of the time, spirits tend to stick around because of trauma, because of unfinished business, and because they still have a tie to the land. And I can't think of a place where there's been more trauma and stress than Salem, so it is loaded with ghosts from the 1692 witch hysteria time period. We go to the location where Giles Corey was painfully pressed to death because he refused to testify. We go to the site where Bridget Bishop, the first woman who was hanged for the crime of witchcraft in Salem, where she lived. We go to the second oldest burial site in the United States, which is right next to the Witch Trials Memorial, and the cruelest of the witch trial judges is buried in there. We also go to the site of the Witch Dungeon. If you want to know specifics or hear stories about any of those particular places, I'd be happy to talk about them. But one thing that sets us aside additionally is we also talk about the vampire legends and folklore, as well as the current vampire culture and its ties to Salem.
Well, that's great. I mean, I want to actually talk about all of that. What I do want to acknowledge first is I know as making a couple films how hard it is to get good reviews. And if people go to your website, you have like 90 reviews and you have like a 4.9 rating, which is like mind blowing. It's awesome, you know?
Yeah. Oh, reviews. We live and die by the reviews. So if anybody's taken a Spellbound tour and wants to help us out, go to TripAdvisor, 5 stars. I will be grateful forever. And also, everybody ought to go on Amazon, watch Afraid of Nothing, and then go give that a 5-star review. I know I did.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. We actually have a contest where if people message me or email me, I have a commercial I put on the podcast. I will pick a winner every month and send them a T-shirt. So that's great.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, I want to talk about the vampires, but first I want to talk about on the tour some of the places, because a lot of them I think you go to 12 locations roughly, and
yeah, approximately 12.
Yeah.
It's always changing too, because every now and again we'll add a different place to spice it up. Sometimes things change and we have to cross a place off the list. So it's always evolving. I've been involved with Spellbound since I believe 2003, and the tour is a constantly evolving organism. We've gotten new evidence, new theories. Technology has changed so much in that time period. I remember when we first started, people were largely bringing the disposable cameras to shoot with. They were hoping to catch ghosts with actual film, and I loved that. Nowadays, everybody has a digital camera attached to their phone. It's on their body at all times, and so we are able to get some pretty cool shots right there in the moment. But I personally think you can't beat real film. If anybody out there wants to get into paranormal investigation, in addition to having a good phone camera, you also want to have a real film camera, at least 800 speed. Get a good one and invest in the film, and always save the negatives. The negatives go a long way in proving the authenticity to show it hasn't been tampered with.
Oh, that's great advice. On your tour, I remember going to a cemetery where the gravestones were really close. Like bodies couldn't be buried under there. And you told us a disturbing thing that the bodies weren't under there. They were actually buried in the church, which is right next to the cemetery.
That is directly adjacent to the field where Giles Corey was pressed. Now, it's a beautiful church. In fact, if you go inside it, you can see it's still very much the reflective of the time period in which it was built, but it used to be a smaller structure. And out behind it was a little graveyard. People were buried behind the church, but when it was time to enlarge and renovate the church, they didn't have anywhere to build. So they moved the tombstones to the little front yard just for decoration. They crammed them all up close, and then they paved over the actual bodies and built the rest of the church on top of the graveyard. The little chapel in the back, if people go in there for church or when they have their little church market every year, you're walking over graves in St. Peter's. Now, it's funny because some of the church ladies who go there, who attend there, are all about the ghost stories and have told me the things that they've seen and they've heard. But there's also people there associated with the church who are not fond of the ghost stories. I know I actually got married in there, and I was hoping that we'd see like screaming ghouls coming out of the floor for the ceremony, but it didn't happen.
Does anyone protest against this marriage? That's great. You were a paranormal investigator before Spellbound Tours, I believe, and I think you were a skeptic before all of this. Is that accurate?
Totally skeptical. I was very lucky to get involved with Spellbound Tours. At the time I joined, it was owned and being run by a woman named Molly Stewart, who is one of the best paranormal investigators I've ever met. And I consider myself lucky that after I had a spooky occurrence in Salem, that she was somebody I was able to look right up and start talking to about the paranormal. I got a really good education from her. What happened that got me changed from being totally skeptic into wanting to delve into it professionally, it happened at the site of the Witch Dungeon. Now, the Witch Dungeon is obviously, unfortunately, no longer a dungeon. It's not the Dungeon Museum. The Dungeon Museum is simply a recreation of the place where they were tortured. The actual dungeon site, nowadays there's a modern office building there. What happened was, in the 1950s, Salem was trying to distance themselves. They were trying to get away from the witch reputation. So the remains of the dungeon were scrapped, and this nondescript, nice little office structure was put up. And one summer in college, I got a job working in that building. Just a totally normal, not ghostly profession. It was actually working for a group that trained lawyers to help pass the bar exam. And so all the people working down there were just very normal, square folks, not the kind of people who'd want to put their reputation on the line talking about ghosts. There were professors and students and lawyers. And I started noticing every afternoon, me and the girl I was working with, we would hear what sounded like heavy footsteps stomping up and down the hallway, and would look out, and there was nobody there. And that was pretty weird. Then it kept happening again. Every afternoon, we'd hear the same heavy footsteps, and then we'd start to see lights going on and off, back and forth, as if somebody was checking on each room as they went. We were the only ones down there at the time, and when I looked into it, the steps were happening around the same time each day that supposedly the jailkeeper would go cell to cell checking on the people who were in prison there. Now, that was pretty weird, but it didn't convince me. I thought it was cool and creepy and unusual. But what really got me thinking is when my friend was attacked by someone we couldn't see. She was sitting down at her desk. She rose up to stand. I think she was taking a break or something. She rose up to stand, and she said it felt like two cold hands grabbed her shoulders and forced her down into her seat. She stood up again, and she was pushed right back down. When she stood up for the third time, she got slapped across the face. We heard the slap ring out, just like a real hard smack. She screamed. She said it felt like a shock of electricity went right through her body, and we saw a big red mark appear on her face shaped like a hand. It was as if someone had slapped her, and we were the only people in that room. Now, she was so spooked, she quit then and there. She did not come back to work the next day. But me, I stuck it out, and I wanted to learn more. And that's when I started doing the research into the history of that building. And I got in touch with Molly Stewart, and she started teaching me things. And eventually, I ended up becoming a tour guide and investigator with her. And when it was time for her to retire, I took over the company. I didn't want Spellbound to go away. In fact, Spellbound is now, I believe, in its 20th year in Salem.
You know, it's kind of interesting because Rob took over the Magic Parlor when those owners gave up the reins because he used to do makeup in front of it.
Frank and Sharon, yep.
Yep. So you have kind of a parallel path.
Yep.
Did you ever find out? Because that's a tremendous amount of energy for something to force someone down and then also to slap someone like that. That's, that's a tremendous amount of energy that a spirit is unleashing on people. And did you ever find out any backstory to what that was related to?
I'm pretty sure that has a connection to Sheriff Corwin. Sheriff Corwin from the Witch Hysteria was a very cruel, angry person. Sheriff Corwin seems to have relished tormenting people, and I would think that he might still be at it, still stomping up and down the halls of the dungeon trying to elicit confessions now, hundreds of years later. I really get a strong sense that Sheriff Corwin could have been involved. Now, that is a very spooky site, by the way. If you ever get a chance to explore, it looks like an office building, but the first thing you'll notice is there's a big sign that says space for lease. There's always space available in there.
Really?
At one point in the early 2000s, there was a little paranormal investigation group in there. There was a museum in there, and people would come in and look at ghost photographs and supernatural curiosities. It was like a little mini Ripley's, and there was a guest book. And if you looked at the guest book, you would see comments like, "This place is really cool, but I could not stay in here for that long. I just had to leave." People were getting spooked by the energy. And as soon as the owner could, she pulled up stakes and moved to a different location in town. Even professional paranormal investigators didn't want to be spending too much time in the dungeon. And you know what? I don't blame them. The actual dungeon that was there was miserable. The cells were so tight and narrow, they were what were called coffin cells. The people who were interned there would be standing up all night and all day. They didn't have anything to eat. They had to buy their own food. They had to pay rent every night in the dungeon. They had to pay for blankets if they wanted to be warm. There was no heat, obviously. Obviously, there was no running water. There was no proper bathroom facilities. When it rained, the cells would flood with water. So these poor people were freezing, starving, and paying for the privilege of it. And definitely there were people who died in those horrible conditions. And we think that their angry spirits are still connected too.
You're still a paranormal investigator too, as well as doing the
Yes, we do the tours 7 days a week. But when we get stories that people have to tell us that sound good enough, we will travel, we will investigate, and I love doing it. I love hearing people's stories, and I love trying to help them out.
Are you psychic at all, or what do you consider yourself? You consider yourself more of a researcher? Are you an empath?
I started out as more of a researcher. Now, as time's gone on, I've become almost more interested in why people believe than what is actually happening. I find myself leaning more towards the folklore and the psychology of all of it. I just am collecting stories and collecting data and information. I do work with somebody who is psychic. She does seem to have some ability. I always like first to go into a place and do the historic research and try to come up with any hard evidence and then send the mediums in to see if what they claim to pick up is going to correlate with the actual history. Yeah, our group is growing. We have trusted people we work with. I have a friend who analyzes the pictures that I personally can't figure out. He actually works for one of the camera companies in New York, so we're in good hands.
And do you have an EVP specialist too, or do you do that, or?
I do the EVP, and I like to do it analog. I like to just do the old-fashioned Panasonic. You end up running through a lot of tape, but believe me, sometimes it's worth it. Probably the spookiest EVP I ever heard comes from the old burial ground, the Charter Street Cemetery in Salem. There is a little tombstone where the inscription on it says the girl's name, and it says age 7 and willing to die.
Oh.
Now, willing to die, because this is such an old stone, the implication is willing to die and go to heaven, like a religious thing. However, the folklore says that perhaps this little girl wasn't willing to die. It's speculated that she was buried alive. According to the story, she'd taken ill, and the family thought she was dead. But when they put her in the casket, the first shovelful of dirt on top of it woke her up, and she started to scream and cry. But because she was sick, they just let her get buried anyway.
Oh, it's awful.
Now, who knows if that's actually true or not, but that's the folklore, and that's what I believe happened. And once we got EVP next to that stone, which sounded like a little girl weeping, and it was just absolutely chilling to hear.
Working on Afraid of Nothing, I went to a bunch of different places. I went to the S.K. Pierce house in Gardner, Mass. I went to Lizzie Borden. I went to Rob's place. I bought a possessed a Ouija board, which the
you were the guy who bought the Ouija board?
I am, yep. And my ex-wife wouldn't let me bring it home, so I carried it in my trunk for like several months. And I started having a ton of, you saw the film anyways.
Yeah, of course.
I never had, I was always Mr. Tunnel Vision. But once I started doing that stuff, I started getting EVPs really easy. Not just like on my car radio, like in the film, but I would go places and pull out the spirit box and I would get things and they would answer like my daughter's name or things like that. It was almost getting too easy and I just stopped because it was like once you opened it up, it just seemed like stuff was coming too easy. So I just kind of stopped it.
It's like you can't put the genie back in the bottle kind of thing.
Yeah. I was surprised at all the stuff I was getting, which was crazy.
What was really funny, really weird, in the middle of last summer, there was a week where just about every time I would leave my house to walk down the street, there'd be discarded Ouija boards just thrown in the middle of the road.
Really?
Yeah, it happened almost every day for a week. I would wake up early to walk the dog, and as we were walking, I'm like, what's that? It's a Ouija board, just right out, being run over by cars. Somebody must have seen something and gotten spooked.
Yeah, that's crazy. Now, you live in, you don't talk about it too much, but I know because you've talked to me offline about it. You live in an apartment or a house that's haunted, correct?
I do. It's the Captain Dean House in Salem, built in 1706, and it was a sea captain's mansion. It does have some Samuel McIntyre features. I know the molding above my fireplace is McIntyre. I think the columns out front and some of the details are McIntyre. And it used to be a pretty opulent place. Eventually, it became chopped up and turned into a hotel. And what's really fun is in my downstairs neighbor's apartment, you can actually see a little door where it used to be the coat check room for the little tea room cafeteria thing in the hotel.
Wow.
And then after that, it was chopped up further into a boarding house. And then it got remodeled slightly on the inside and turned into a whole bunch of cool little apartments. Now, this house is definitely haunted. I know when I first moved in, I had moved in with somebody, and she would say that she was seeing things. She would always describe seeing a shadowy, angry figure sort of lurking near the bathroom door. And I didn't quite believe her because I wasn't seeing anything myself, but she said she had that sensation. We also had a party where one of my friends, who is enormously skeptical, had an experience. Everybody was sitting around and just talking and having fun. And the silence, the talking, the sound was broken by a tremendous crash. And I looked, I'm like, hey, be careful. What had happened was a big, full bottle had landed at my friend's feet, a bottle that had previously been on the coffee table. He turned white and just gasped. I was like, I didn't touch that thing. And everybody else agreed that they had simply seen the bottle levitate and smash down at his feet.
Wow.
That was weird enough. But the really good story comes from one night after the tour. I'd walked home, unlocked the front door, walked up the hallway, and was unlocking the door to my apartment. I had the dog with me. And as I unlocked the door, we heard a female voice from inside the apartment just say, "Good dog."
Oh, my God.
And it was so natural that at first I didn't think anything of it. I thought a friend was over because I knew somebody was probably going to be visiting later. And I thought that was her. Then I realized, wait, nobody's in the house. She doesn't have a key. And yet we heard this phrase, "good dog," from inside right beyond the door.
Oh.
And at that point, he didn't want to enter. I had to pull him into the house. He stood sniffing as if there was a person there, and he would not enter through the door without being dragged in. And I checked to make sure that the neighbors didn't have their TV on. Nobody was hiding in the house playing tricks on me. And it was just very strange. And then I did a little bit more research on the house. Turned out after the original owner, the captain, had died at sea, his widow had become something of an animal hoarder. She loved animals. And it would make sense that if she was going to be connecting with somebody, it was going to be the dog and not me.
Wow, that's great.
That was very spooky.
And did you say you had something just recently, or was that the recent one?
No, that was a couple of years ago. The recent one was it's a little bit more mundane than that. But I was sitting here, I was doing another one of these podcasts, and just in the middle of the conversation, my television blasted on out of nowhere, and it interrupted the whole thing. I had to go and turn it off, and it just didn't make any sense. There was no remote near me. There was no timer to turn it on. I honestly feel like somebody wanted to be noticed and didn't necessarily like the fact that I was talking about ghostly stuff in its presence.
That's excellent. I mean, are you nervous being in a place that you think is haunted, or are you just very calm and relaxed about it because you're around it all the time?
I've had some very scary situations. There are some haunted places I would not want to go to again, but I am totally comfortable in this house. It doesn't feel like anything malevolent. It doesn't feel bad. I'm comfortable here.
Hello, listeners. We interrupt this podcast for some shameless self-promotion. Sorry about that.
Hello, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Reading, PA, Chicago, my kind of town, Beverly, Mass, Gardner, Mass, Auburn, Mass, Burlington, Ontario, and Manhattan, my favorite cocktail. In New York, not really. You're the top 10 listening locations. Keep on listening. Our Afraid of Nothing podcast has over 2,300 episodes dropped. Mostly in the U.S., but also in 23 other countries. Thank you, merci beaucoup, gracias, and thank you in a million billion ways. Our documentary is also killing it on Amazon Prime. Sure, we have a few haters out there, but you, our faithful listeners, you're the ones that really matter. So thanks, big thanks, mega thanks. Hey, these are tough times, and we have to keep each other positive and entertained. Okay, last plug. Do check out, as in check out, buying the merch from the Afraid of Nothing online store. That's AONpodcaststore.com. Just because no one can see you aren't wearing pants doesn't mean you can't be wearing a cool t-shirt. Okay, back to the show. Now, Essex Street. I mean, there's a couple of places that are haunted on Essex Street, correct? I mean, there's, I think Tim McGuire, who was in the film too, doesn't he have kind of the magic wand where he has the basement below, which he won't go into by himself?
Yes. Tim is always telling me stories about that place.
Yeah, do you mind regaling us about that just a little bit? Because it's like he had mentioned it, and it's actually in the film too. But about how it's next to his. Well, he has what? Remembering Salem.
He's got Remember Salem, which is the fun Harry Potter shop, and then there's the wand place next to it.
Yeah.
I can tell you years ago that I would be in there in the back of Remember Salem when it was a different shop. There used to be a Gothic clothing store called the Fool's Mansion.
Uh-huh.
And one year in October, I set up a freak show exhibit in that back room. And it was just very spooky. Sometimes in between the shows, we would just hear sounds creaking, and the curtain partitions we put up would move about on their own a little bit, especially down in the basement. There was just always a strong presence. In fact, we actually did a cursory investigation of that basement for one of the ghost hunting TV shows. I think Tim is going to be getting some of those guys in there to do events starting this summer, actually.
Interesting. Yeah. Because, he's a big guy, and doesn't look he's afraid of too much, but he said that was one place, that basement down in that wand shop, where he does not like to go alone, which, totally believes him.
I don't blame him. I don't blame him. That one is spooky. And also, the really spooky place in Salem is the basement of the Hawthorne House at the House of the Seven Gables.
Really? Is there a shadow man there? Or what? I'm sure. What's the entity that's there?
You hit it on the head.
Okay, all right.
I haven't been down there in years and years and years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was down there creeping around. I was with some friends who weren't necessarily serious about investigating, but we wanted to take a look. And it's a big basement. It's basically one big room, but it's got sort of a divider, an arch in the middle of it.
Uh-huh.
And once I walked through that arch, it felt like there was somebody standing right in front of me. You couldn't see it, but it was the evilest, coldest, nastiest feeling I had ever encountered. And then as I turned to walk away from it, it was like it was right there on the other side. It was trying to prohibit me from going out.
Wow.
It was very bizarre. It was almost like a standoff between me and this dark, empty space for a couple of minutes. Eventually dissipated, and I was able to get through, but that is a site I would not go down into again.
Now, have you ever brought any attachments home with you, or what do you do to protect yourself?
I welcome it. I let it come. I want to encourage it. My house is filled with cursed, creepy objects, and I have not suffered from it at all.
Wow. You remind me, there's another guest I had called Danny Perez. I don't know if you know him. He does...
Oh, yeah. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, he's great.
The Ouija board guy. He's cool.
Yeah,
Actually, I've got one of his boards here when he did with sideshow characters on it.
Oh, yeah. I have one, serial killers.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. I want him to make one for Afraid of Nothing, too. I think we'll be able to get to it. Yeah, he was on an earlier episode. He and his...
I love that bow tie he has that looks like the cane toad thing.
Yeah, he's great. So many guests feel like they're not going to be good guests, but they end up being great guests because they're so modest, but once they start talking about stuff, they do a great job. He was great. Now his wife Lauren was on that show too, and it's really, that's one of the episodes that's very popular. We get tons of downloads on that. So let's talk about vampires. when people think of Salem, they think of witches and they think maybe of ghosts, but they don't think of vampires. Tell us kind of how you got acclimated or kind of got exposed to vampires and present day vampires as well. You're kind of in the inner circle there a little bit, I think.
Originally, when Spellbound Tours was first started, I think they just shoehorned the vampires in a little bit to jump in on the interview with the vampire type theme. It was in that time period when that kind of opulent gothic vampires was very much in the popular culture. But since then, since the late 90s and early 2000s, Salem has become a hotbed of true vampire activity. Now, real vampires are not what you see in the movies. You're not going to see anybody being able to transform. You're not going to see fangs grow in their mouth. They're regular people just like you or I, but what makes somebody a vampire is the fact that they have a lust for human blood. And there are several different categories. There are people who are called imitation vampires. Those are the ones who they enjoy the costuming of it. They enjoy the lifestyle of it. They might drink blood, probably not. They're just harmless. They're the folks you see in costume, like the lifestyle vampires. Then there are the blood fetishists, and those are people who get excited by the sight, the smell, or the taste of human blood. For the most part, it's a sexual thing to them, and for the most part, they're not going to be stalking you and murdering you for blood. They're only drinking blood consensually. But the third type are what are the so-called true vampires, and the true vampires are the ones you want to watch out for. These are the people who are mentally ill, who believe that if they drink your blood, they'll be able to take on powers of the mythic vampires. Thankfully, it does not work. They're not going to get powers. If anything, they're most likely to get sick from drinking blood. The human body is not meant to guzzle down raw human blood from another person, but some of these poor folks are mentally addicted to it. It's a mental addiction rather than a physical addiction, but they definitely lust for blood.
Where do they get their blood? That third one. Where do they get it?
Well, they have usually what's called a donor. Most of the time, the blood fetishist will have a partner who willingly gives them blood, somebody who's into it and enjoys it. But there are other people, and this is going into serial killer type territory, Richard Chase type stuff, where they will go out and kill for it. That is extremely rare, but it does happen from time to time. Now, Salem used to have a store, a really cool, really interesting little place called Life and Death. Now, the woman who owned Life and Death is a friend of mine, and it was an oddities shop. She sold human bones, and she sold sideshow paraphernalia and just weird graveyard stuff. And she thought it would be good publicity to let a group of modern vampires hold their meetings there. She thought it was going to be a role-playing game kind of thing or something. But what she ended up with was a support group for people who were living as vampires, including people who may or may not have been drinking blood. Unfortunately, Life and Death is not here anymore, but there are true blood drinkers among us in Salem. And I've done some research, and even though it seems like a more modern phenomena, going back to the 1960s, there was the Count Dracula Society was formed out of Salem. It was a one-man effort which grew to have followers all over the world. One singular guy was obsessed with the vampire idea, and he decided to make his home in Salem. I'm actually trying to track him down and see if he's still alive or if he has any of his papers still stored. And there's also new vampire folklore that we keep finding out. It's a constantly evolving situation.
How did you get into contact with them? Was it through that friend that had the Life and Death? What was the name of the store?
Yep, Life and Death is how I met some of the vampires. But other times they'll just come up to me. At the end of the tour, I always stand around and let people ask questions and show me their photographs. And I remember one night there was a very nice girl who asked if I wanted to go get a drink with her. And I said, sure. Now, she didn't look the part. She didn't look like a vampire. She wasn't dressed in anything gothic. She didn't have fangs in her mouth. She just looked like a very average, basic girl. But when we sat down, we went to the Hawthorne, we sat down, and it turned out she didn't want to go on a date. She asked if she could drink my blood. She thought that because I was talking about vampires and open to their existence, that I would be a potential donor. And I had to tell her, no, thank you. I wasn't interested.
Yeah.
There was another case where there was a couple on the tour who had been some of the best guests, the best guest we'd ever had. They were laughing, they were taking photographs, they were into it, they were nodding along until we got to the vampire content. And I noticed their whole mood shifted. They got really upset and angry. And as we were walking away, I took them aside and asked them what was the matter. Why were they upset all of a sudden? And they said the reason they got mad is that they were vampires. One of them was the vampire, the other was the donor. And they did not like the fact that we were publicly discussing them and acknowledging that they were a real thing. They said they wanted to remain in the shadows. And much like the vampire girl I mentioned, they were totally normal. You wouldn't be able to pick them up out of a lineup at all. They just looked like regular folk.
So that is one element of Salem that remains underground and considered taboo. A lot of everything is more accepted, I guess, but that is one group that maybe they could be embraced, I guess, but they consider themselves taboo and they kind of like to keep to themselves.
Well, just like anything, it's all individual from person to person and group to group.
Yep.
There's also what are called psychic vampires, and I generally don't like to discuss them. In my mind, you need to be drinking blood to be considered a vampire.
Yep.
But there are people who believe they feed on other people's energy. The best way to describe a psychic vampire is we all have a friend or someone we know who, when we spend time with them, they just drain the life out of you.
Yeah.
And some people believe that they are doing it actively. They think that they're able to suck your energy out of you and power themselves up with your energy. And many people in the vampire world do that. They consider themselves energy vampires and would never touch a drop of blood. But for my interests, I prefer the ones who are actually drinking blood.
Wow.
And if you want to become a vampire, a really cool thing is at the Magic Parlor, Rob will fit you for custom vampire fangs.
Boy, Rob, he's such a giver.
And to give you an idea just how wild Salem is, a couple of years ago, I went to a regular dentist. I went to get a cleaning, and I also wanted a gold tooth. I'd always wanted a gold tooth put in. And the dentist was happy to do it, but he also asked if I wouldn't rather have permanent fangs put in. He actually showed me the patterns he has just on file for if people want to get real dental quality, non-removable vampire fang teeth. And this is just like a normal dentist. Just the dentist right here in Salem was offering to give me permanent fangs.
I wonder, because teeth are sensitive. Once they file them down, are they still as strong or what? I digress, but it just seems that's interesting. There's so many things I want to talk about. Let's voodoo. You don't usually think of voodoo when you think of Salem, but it's there, and it's there in its history, and it's there now, according to you, right? So you want to enlighten us about that?
Yep. The real link between voodoo and Salem goes back to the Salem witch trials. One of the biggest protagonists of the Salem witch trials was a woman named Tituba, and Tituba was a slave. Now, most of the time when you think of slaves in American history, the image that comes to mind is a person of African descent. But Tituba was actually an American Indian. She was an indigenous person from South America who was kidnapped and sold into slavery, and she ended up in Barbados. When she was in Barbados, she lived with the slaves of African descent, and from them she picked up on their rituals and their tradition. But when the white masters would come around, the slaves had to cover up what they were doing and disguise their rituals as Christian rituals. They would say that they were praying to the saints and that kind of thing. And Tituba picked up on that. That combination of Christianity, African-derived religion, and Native American spirituality, all of that muddled together and merged, grew into what we would consider voodoo. And Tituba was practicing voodoo in Salem. She was sold again. She ended up being owned by Reverend Paris. And it's terrible to think of a minister having slaves, but that's the way it was back then. Tituba was taken to Salem, and she was in charge of, among other things, taking care of the Reverend's daughters. Now, these people were Puritans, and Puritan life was boring and miserable and strict. Nobody was having fun, and some of the only entertainment the girls would get was listening to Tituba tell stories. She would tell folklore, she would tell tales of life in the islands and that kind of thing. And the girls started getting spooked. They were hearing Tituba's voodoo tales, and they liked it, but they knew that if their parents found out, they would be in big trouble. They weren't supposed to be hanging out with the slave, and they were definitely not supposed to be hearing sacrilegious things. So they were all bottled up and kept it tight. And when they finally came out, the stress had built up in them so much they freaked out. They started twitching and shaking and speaking in tongues. And nowadays we know that stress can bring on hysteria. But back then, the ignorant doctor, Dr. Griggs, he examined the girls. He couldn't find out what was wrong with them, so he just claimed they'd been bewitched. Now, Tituba was the one who accidentally set this whole thing off by telling the stories. So she was right at the center of it. She was one of the very first people accused of witchcraft, and she was also the smartest person in Salem. Because when they brought her to trial, they asked her, Tituba, are you a witch? You know what she said? She said, yes. And because she admitted to being a witch, the Puritans didn't really know what to do with her. They figured that if she had admitted it, she must have repented. And the Puritans loved penitent sinners. So rather than execute Tituba, they made her the star witness. They had her point the finger at other people who might be witches. And Tituba really knew who to point the finger at. She was the minister's slave, so she knew everybody's dirty business. And a lot of the witch trials history, a lot of the supernatural elements of it come directly from Tituba's made-up testimony and made-up stories. Now, unfortunately, because she was a slave, she didn't have the money to pay her rent at the dungeon, so she had to languish there until somebody purchased her. But at least she was able to escape with her life.
Wow. Now that's great.
And so that's the thing. Tituba was practicing an early form of voodoo. She wasn't calling it voodoo, but the mixture of English, Christian, Native, and African religions all swirled together that developed into what we would call voodoo nowadays. And there's a lot of overlap between Salem and New Orleans. People in the paranormal community go from city to city. There's a lot of people who will vacation in both places. In fact, there's a wonderful little shop. It's called Botanica San Miguel, and you can get supplies there. Also, they just opened the Hermetic Arts Center. I was just in there the other day, and it is one of the most beautiful occult shops I've ever seen, and they have a load of voodoo supplies.
You went to Louisiana, right? You went to do some research about voodoo down there, correct?
I certainly did. I actually lived there for a little bit. But probably my favorite voodoo story comes from around the time when I first moved to Salem. I'd come here to go to Salem State University. This was so long ago, it was still Salem State College. They hadn't tacked the university onto it.
Yeah.
And I was in a real hurry to get to Salem, so I just answered an ad for roommates. I didn't know who I was going to be moving in with. And the two guys were both relatively recently arrived from Haiti. And one of them was the nicest, coolest guy in the world. The other guy was kind of a jerk, but they were both good roommates. However, I started noticing things. I would be lying in bed at night, and even in the darkness of my room, I'd see these dark shadows moving around, sort of shadow people type figure, which was definitely very creepy. And then I noticed one day that there were tiny little bone altars, little chicken bone things lashed together. It looked like something out of the movies, just buried underneath the front steps of the house. And they had just been little creepy things like that, like unnatural things. There'd be presences around, there'd be little symbolic offerings left around. First, I asked the guy I didn't like, I was like, do you know anything about this? And he got kind of annoyed and said, no, absolutely not. No, nobody here would do that. Then I asked the one who was kind of my friend, and he said that yes, both he and the other one had been doing various voodoo rituals for protection against the alleged shadow people. Now, what you got to consider is the shadow people are not what we traditionally consider ghosts. Most of the time when we're talking about ghosts, it's the spirit or soul of a person who's departed. And for whatever reason, whether it's conscious or whether it's just an energy shadow, it's leftover energy. The shadow people are more analogous with what the Western world would call demon. And so when I first moved to Salem, I apparently had moved into a house with demons.
Yeah, who was protecting you? I mean, they were doing this stuff for them, but you had no protection during that point, huh?
Yeah. I mean, to give you an idea just how prevalent spooky stuff is in Salem, I was at a Christmas party last year, and somebody found out about what I do and what I'm into, and they said they had an antique Ouija board. They had been they were an electrician, and they were up in an old attic, and they were told they could take anything of interest they wanted while they were cleaning out to get the wiring done, and apparently there was this ancient Ouija board. I told him I wanted to see it, and as luck would have it, it was just sitting in his trunk. So in the middle of this Christmas party, he walks in with his great big wooden Ouija board, and on first glance, I could immediately see there was blood stains on it. So I bought the Ouija board right then and there.
Yeah.
Then I was talking to the guy about it, and it turns out not only are there bloodstains on the Ouija board, the place where he had salvaged it from, the person who had previously owned it, killed himself.
Wow.
He killed himself after using the board. He said that he was mentally ill, but he was using the board, and that apparently set him off. And then they just put the board up in the attic and left it there to rot.
I bet you bought that board for cheaper than Rob sold me my board.
Most definitely.
That's funny. The funny story is, I think he typically sells them for $50, and I bought it for $75. I offered $75.
Well, when you've got a board with a curse on it, you got to pay.
Oh yeah,
you got to pay per demon.
A 7 in that one. Yeah, crazy. So
didn't Little Frog sort of exorcise them?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Brad. And look, Brad can be very dramatic. He believes in what he does, and he's helped a ton of people. And so he went into the magic parlor. It's a scene where he walks in. I actually cut that scene down a lot, and because I had to cut it down for dramatic effect. Some people, if there's any criticism for the film, I get it kind of on that scene a lot because it's so dramatic. He's shaking the board and all that stuff. But I really had to cut it down. I mean, as soon as he walked in, he sensed the board. He said, "Oh yeah, there's something." And then just as we were going to start to clear it, he asked for permission. The audio went out. And, that's typical. That happens with audio equipment. But the sound was going into the mixer, but it wasn't coming out. It was really weird. So we had to use a boom mic for the rest of that day. When we went to interview Tim McGuire, who we talked about earlier, and kind of his story, Remembering Salem, and kind of that haunted basement, we had to use a boom mic because that mixer stopped working after that. And that was right when we started doing it, just as soon as he started clearing it. And he actually spent, I cut that down a lot. He actually spent a good 10 minutes there, sweating and trying to get stuff out of there because he usually is pretty quick on stuff, but he had a hell of a time going into that and he kept finding stuff in there. And I had, like I said, when I filmed that, I had to, for our posterity, really shorten things and cut things down a bit, but he was there for a lot longer than what we showed in the film. He apparently cleansed it. I took it, went in my car, and I started getting a bunch of EVPs, and eventually I gave it to a witch. Actually, it's a couple that were on a prior episode, Ken and Mimi Watson. She's a practicing witch and a medium and all this great stuff. And they both renovated the S.K. Pierce house. So I gave them the board. They had no issues with it, which is good. But yeah, that's what happened to that. So you're right. Salem is not like pockets of stuff. It's like it permeates. It sounds like, the ghost. There's all over the place. It really is a very haunted town. And I don't think that's bluster. It's just very true. There's a lot of energy in that place.
It almost seems kind of ironic that a place that was persecuting fake witches is now home to some of the biggest population of modern day witches and pagans and people on alternative spiritual paths anywhere in the country.
Yeah.
Salem really is the home of the witches. And I think that's very cool to be in a place where witchcraft is not only accepted, but for the most part embraced. And there's so many different ways to practice witchcraft. You don't have to follow any specific path you don't want to. It's a very personal kind of religion. And I think that it's nice that right here in New England, we have the seat of witchcraft here. It seems like an important kind of thing. It seems like modern Salem is almost apologizing for what happened back in 1692. And to bring it back to 1692, when you mentioned a second ago about how Salem is just thick with hauntings, it's not pockets of hauntings, it's hauntings all the time. A lot of the spirits that we talk about on the tour and that I've dealt with as far as investigation and research are spirits who are directly tied to the witch trials. Giles Corey, for example, you can't tell the Salem story without hearing about him. Bridget Bishop, all the different judges, Corwin. Those people are still here and are haunting and they're still upset. But you know who isn't? Tituba.
I was just thinking that.
I have never had anybody claim to have encountered Tituba's spirit. I've never had anybody claim to be reincarnated from Tituba or descended from Tituba. I feel like she got out of it pretty clean. She was enslaved, which was awful, and she was tortured, which was awful, but she kept herself spiritually above it all, I guess, and was able to move on, unlike a lot of the other folks who were involved with the witch trials. Both the victims and the accusers, they're still haunting. Tituba seems to have made peace with the whole thing.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, as it was kind of almost coming to me, that thought as you were bringing it, and it's like, Tituba, what about Tituba? It's like, yes, that's absolutely true. You know, in the last few minutes we have, I'd like to hear about, on your website has some great stuff about your personal stories. Do you have one or two personal stories, whether it's someone told you on one of your tours or that you've had yourself that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I'll tell you one that I think is just a really funny one, and I'll tell you one that is legitimately disturbing.
Okay.
The funny story happened when some guests were checking in to the tour, and I asked them where they were from. They said West Virginia, and I said, "Oh, Mothman country," and they both started laughing and laughing, and you expect them to laugh, but not that much. And as the tour was winding down, they wanted to tell me why they were laughing so much. It was because apparently in the 1970s, one of their cousins shot Mothman, or that's what they told me. And so I asked them, I was very incredulous, like, what? You think this story would have been reported if somebody actually shot Mothman? And the way they described it sounds more like a murder. They said that they were driving and they saw a little man and they shot him and then buried him.
Oh, God. Just...
Yeah, that's the story. Somehow they were convinced that little person was the famous cryptid Mothman, shot him, and then hid the body, and then never talked about it until they told me, a complete stranger, 40 years later.
What do you do with that, right? Oh, my God.
I just kind of filed it away and enjoyed the tale. And believe me, once I got done the tour that night, I went and told everybody, you're not going to believe it, but I just gave a tour to the guy whose cousin killed the Mothman.
Crazy.
So if you're listening, turn yourself in, Mothman murderer.
Yes, and show us where that body is buried.
Yeah, I think they killed a person, but who knows?
Oh, God.
That was just a silly one. But here's probably the most disturbing true ghost story that I've ever heard. And this comes from my time working in the carnival business. I've worked for the World of Wonders, which was a traveling sideshow. I also worked for Jim Zychek's Big Circus Sideshow. And for a little while, I owned my own show of that nature. And when we were doing the Big Circus Sideshow, one of the exhibits was what they called the Evil Dwarf. The advertising for the Evil Dwarf was a beautiful banner where it looked like a nasty little dwarf flashing Snow White. It was a very comical thing. But inside the tent, after people had paid to see the Evil Dwarf, they would be looking at a skeleton. Skeleton in a box with a little story written up about it, saying how he'd been a Wild West outlaw in addition to being a little person. And after he died, his bones were put on exhibition for all to see as a warning kind of thing. Well, Jim, the guy who owned the Evil Dwarf, told me that he had acquired the skeleton, the bones, and it wasn't actually a dwarf. It was just skeleton that he put into a box and framed up and created the legend about. Well, he brought it home, and his girlfriend at the time said, absolutely not. We are not having that thing in the house. And he was like, oh, fine, we'll use it as a coffee table. It's going to be fine. And she started having horrific nightmares about the skeleton. She said that she was seeing who the skeleton had been in life. It was a little girl who'd been terribly abused by her family, her father in particular, and then had murdered her by smashing her head. Well, these stories got so weird, and the girlfriend didn't want the skeleton in the house, so Jim dragged it into the garage and forgot about it until the next year when it was sideshow season again, and the evil dwarf was back on the road. Well, one day...
Hey, do you mind if I interject something real quick? Just so people know, I think this is a coffin that the cover was taken off and a plate of glass was put across. So when you say coffee table, it's, it's a glass coffee table where you can peer down into the remains of...
And see a small skeleton in there.
Yeah, so it's not like, so it's like very visual coffee table. Yeah.
You're there with the evil dwarf.
Yes.
So what happens next is the evil dwarf is in the sideshow tent, and two young women are in the tent looking at the dwarf. And they are looking at it way too long for Jim to be comfortable. Like when people look at something way too long in a sideshow type setting, usually that means there's going to be some trouble. So he goes over and he asks the girls, he's like, "So how do you like the evil dwarf?" And they look at him and say, "Well, I don't think it's a dwarf." He's like, "Oh, what do you mean?" Well, it turns out the girls were anthropology students from a local college, and they were able to discern by looking at the body that it was not a dwarf. It was actually a young girl who died of head trauma, just like Jim's girlfriend had seen in her visions about the evil dwarf.
Wow.
And so I worked with this thing for a year. I would unload and unload the evil dwarf into the truck. I never had any problems with him, but knowing that story was just that was chilling.
That's like a 360 turn on something that you thought you knew. And it just becomes much more tragic than you could ever imagine. Now that was, I think I recall reading on your blog or on your website that the person who sold that to the gentleman who owned the sideshow seemed very relieved to get rid of it. Like he had uncovered it. Like, I don't know, did they dig it up or something, or how did they?
Yeah, they had been putting cement on something. I don't remember what they were building, but it had actually come from an Indian reservation, believe it or not. So it has yet another layer of potential spookiness on top of it.
Wow, that's crazy. So thank you so much. As I anticipated, you're always a great person to talk to. You're very entertaining and engaging. People are going to want to see you in real life and kind of go on some tours with you. Tell them where to go for Spellbound Tours to find out more. Great website. It goes in detail about the places that you stop, and talk about kind of how they can get tickets and come experience Salem firsthand.
Spellboundtours.com. That is our ticket website. You can read our blog, which we update from time to time. You can also, if you want, go to the Spellbound Salem Facebook page. What's really fun on that is if you scroll back, you can see some live videos I did during the pandemic. You can watch and get little virtual tours of Salem. And for the full experience, if you go to spellboundtours.com, you can purchase tickets. Starting on July 10th, we're going to be going every night at 8 p.m., as well as 2 p.m. on the weekends, and we're probably going to be adding more times. Now, a good thing for you is that the amount of people that we're allowed to have on the tour has been severely limited by the pandemic. We can only take 10 people at a time, which means that it's going to be a much more intimate experience. People are going to be able to ask more questions. They're going to be able to get closer to the historic sites, and it's a lot of fun. I'd recommend it. And even if you don't buy tickets, you can get in touch with me through the website. It's Dr. Vitka at spellboundtours.com. If you have ghost stories you want to share with me, if you want advice, if you've got ghost photographs you want us to look at, feel free to just reach out, and I'll be happy to talk to you.
And that's DRVITKA at spellboundtours.com. And if they're in Salem and they want to buy tickets, where could they go, like live, walking around Salem? Where could they get tickets?
Magic Parlor, definitely. If you're looking to get tickets while you're in town, you need to check out the Magic Parlor. And they also have a beautiful selection of monster masks and witchcraft supplies. It's probably the most fun place in Salem.
Oh, it's incredible. I can tell you, I know your tour is tremendous, and I know that place is great from the documentary and from knowing you both. And it's just a lot of stores, it's Salem. Some may take themselves pretty seriously, but Rob has fun with that store. He has really an eclectic mix of things in there, which are really awesome. You won't find in probably 99.99% of stores in the country or in the world. So you really want to check it out. and then you'll get to meet Dr. Vitka and go on a tour. It's highly, highly recommended.
That's why the Magic Parlor was a perfect fit for Spellbound Tours, was because we take the paranormal very seriously, but we also understand that it's fun and it's entertaining.
Yeah. And that's the way to look at life, I think, with what we're going through. So, Dr. Vitka, I'd be calling you Mike because I consider us friends, because you've helped me so much on my film. But Dr. Vitka is a tour, and please do check him out. And thank you for your time today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. It was fun. I'll be happy to come back if you ever need me again.
Would love it.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.